You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 29.
That night in a hospital in downtown Shangri-La, a yeti doctor named Vox stood and contemplated the three giant human beings who were sleeping in the darkened intensive care ward. She was dressed in a white medical toga and held in her furry hands a large envelope marked with the word X-rays, followed by the patients' names. The ward was quiet, save for the regular beep-beep-beep of the patients' heart monitors and the sound of their deep, rhythmic breathing. They lay in separate beds, each man's crushed body heavily bandaged. Sensors and wires placed on their heads, chest, and hands led to the bank of medical equipment behind their beds. Intravenous lines fed fluids and medicines into their broken limbs. The digital readouts over the beds shone brightly in the half-light, casting a green glow over the humans' faces and silver hair. Vox was the doctor in charge of their medical care. When they arrived at the hospital 48 hours ago, she had been astounded to find a weak but regular heartbeat in each man's crushed chest. Their misshapen bodies, blackened with patches of frostbite, looked like corpses. Their faces were bloodied and bruised, their limbs contorted and broken. Each man was immediately sent to the emergency room where their bones were reset and their bodies bandaged up. When they were wheeled into the intensive care ward, Vox rated their chances of survival at no greater than 10%. She fully expected them to be dead by morning. For Vox, it was a constant source of amazement that human beings exposed themselves to such grave danger merely for the passing thrill of climbing a mountain. She had little doubt that every human who came to the Himalayas was aware of the risks. Yet still they came, and in recent years their numbers had dramatically increased. If the current trend continued, the number of injured humans being brought to Shangri-La would become a drain on the hospital's resources. In her view, the hospital's principal concern was to provide health services to citizens of Shangri-La. Non-citizens could have the spare beds if there were any. Her oath as a doctor extended to assisting humans in need, but in the coming years the council may have to reconsider its policy on rescuing wayward mountain climbers. Vox was a talented doctor, and she enjoyed her work. Her tertiary study included human physiology, and in recent years she had gained experience in the field. Medically speaking, she was familiar with the human body, but she had never seen any human beings who looked quite like her three present patients. At first, she didn't notice anything amiss. Their bone structure was hidden by their bruising and other injuries. When the skin lacerations began to heal and the swelling subsided, she noticed the strange shapes of their heads, which were enlarged and elongated at the tops of their craniums. After a closer inspection, she decided their hands and arms were irregular by human standards, and their overall proportions were odd. She consulted her textbooks on human physiology and could find no references to such skeletal structures. On a hunch, she checked a zoology textbook on simian physiology. There, she found diagrams of monkey skeletons that inexplicably matched aspects of her patient's bone structure. However, she was reluctant to pursue the matter, because the notion that the trio were half monkey and half human was ridiculous. In all likelihood, they were an uncommon ethnicity of human that she had never encountered before. She returned the textbook to the library and focused on returning her patients to good health. She yawned. It was late and her shift was almost over. Switching on a backlit X-ray viewer, she removed 3 films from the envelope and slotted them onto the viewer, looking at each one in turn. She frowned and checked the patients' names on the envelope. No mistake there, these were the right films. She studied the X-rays more closely, examining each bone. Impossible, she thought to herself. 48 hours ago, these guys were busted up from head to toe. But now their skeletons are reformed and proportioned and the fractures are 30% healed. She checked a copy of the X-rays taken when the patients arrived at the hospital, then picked up the phone and called her supervisor. Dr. Gorgon, the chief of medicine at the downtown hospital, was a physician with decades of medical experience but no time for new doctors. "It's late, Dr. Vox," he replied sternly, after she asked him to come down to the intensive care ward. "What is it you want to talk about?" "Some anomalies in the way 3 of my human patients are healing," Dr. Vox explained apologetically. "I've never seen anything like it. I think you should come and see for yourself." 10 minutes later, Dr. Gorgon hobbled into the quiet ward, leaning on a walking stick. He was a poor physical specimen by yeti standards. Short and wiry, with a patchy coat of graying fur that was never much to look at even when he was in his prime years. His vigor and his eyes had faded with old age, but his mind and his tongue were as sharp as ever. Vox explained the situation. Gorgon glanced at the x-rays and observed, they're healing up nicely. So what's the problem? She pulled the films off the viewer and slotted in a series of x-rays depicting the patient's broken bodies. This is what they looked like when they were brought in 48 hours ago, she stated. Gorgon looked at the glowing images disbelievingly. That's impossible, he muttered. Nobody can heal that fast, not even a yeti. Must have been a mix-up with the films. Vox shook her head and replied, there's no mix-up. Jabbing his walking stick in the direction of the patients, he asked, these are the humans, Vox nodded. Gorgon hobbled across the ward and leaned over Flat Top, looking closely and sniffing the air, like a lion examining a fresh kill to decide which part was the most tender. He spent several minutes near Flat Top, studying him from head to foot, after which he moved to Mohawk and mane. Vox watched in silence. Eventually, Gorgon stood up, moved away and stared at the x-rays. There's something odd about the bone structure, he muttered quietly. It's plainly not Yetian, but it's not entirely human either. Vox smiled slightly. I wondered myself, it looks almost simian, like a gorilla, she volunteered. Gorgon glanced at her sharply, remembering that this was one of the hospital's brighter young doctors. What was the blood work like? He asked. Strange, Vox admitted. High in red and white blood cells, lymphocytes and monocytes. Healthy LDK and CPK analysis, but at the extreme end of the scale. Sharply elevated hormone levels, including a naturally produced steroid chemically distinct from human testosterone. No DNA work done, I presume? Gorgon asked. Vox inclined her head. In the intensive care ward, she queried. No, there's no need. Gorgon looked back at the sleeping GXs thoughtfully. Do we know anything about them? He mused. Who they are, where they come from. They have South Korean passports, Vox replied. That's all we know. Gorgon shook his head. This policy of letting complete strangers into Shangri-La will be the ruin of us all, he muttered. Send some cell samples down to the molecular biology lab and tell them to run the genome. Make sure I get a copy of the results. Vox nodded and said, I'll do it first thing tomorrow morning. Gorgon peered up at her. I think we should do it right now, Doctor, he remarked. He turned and hobbled toward the door. Would you tell me what you're thinking, Dr. Gorgon? Vox asked. I'm thinking the humans might have found a way to create the biological equivalent of an atomic bomb, he replied darkly over his shoulder. Evolution separated the humans and the great apes 1,000,000 years ago. The last thing we need is a hybrid species living on this planet, challenging both human and yeti for dominance. The door to the ward slammed shut, leaving Vox alone with the 3 silver-haired patients and the regular beep-beep-beep of the heart monitors. She collected the equipment she needed and began to obtain cell samples, thinking about what Gorgon had said. The look of surprise remained on her furry face for some time. After being discharged from hospital, Gulbenkian and the teenagers were officially homeless until Abby kindly offered to accommodate them at her parents' house. Their tour of downtown Shangri-La ended with the surreal experience of having dinner with the parents and talking about why they had come to Nepal. By unspoken agreement, the teenagers decided not to mention that they were hunting for yeti. The entire time, Isabelle never quite got over sitting so close to 4 giant yetis with very large teeth. It was like sitting down to eat dinner with a family of gorillas. In the presence of his parents, Zaw kept his smart mouth shut for much of the meal. The guest room was large enough for the 4 of them. There were no beds. They slept as yetis did, on mats placed on the ground. In the subtropical heat, only a thin sheet covering the body was necessary. It was dark outside the window of the room, the UV lights of Shangri-La having grown dim some hours ago in an approximation of the setting sun. It was thus far the strongest indicator to Isabelle that the yetis, though well adapted to living underground, did not belong there. She lay awake for several hours, listening to the others sleep fitfully on the mats beside hers. After a while she sensed that Laheeti was still awake. Can't sleep, she whispered. She heard the sheet rustle as he turned toward her. No, he replied. What about you? Nope, my brain's still buzzing with everything I saw today, she whispered. It's like I'm in a dream or something. Everything still seems completely unreal. Yeah, but the more yetis I talk to, the more normal they seem, don't you think? Laheeti mused. Isabelle looked over at him but could only make out the shadow of his face in the darkness. I don't know if you noticed, she began, but they've got fur all over their bodies. They're from another species and they're huge. I know they look different to us, but underneath all of that they're the same as us, Laheeti remarked. They're normal, in fact they're better than normal. Better than normal? Isabelle queried. Well, take this place, Shangri-La, began Laheeti. It's a utopia, right? I mean, there's no homelessness, no poverty. No massive divide between the rich and the poor. Everybody has a place to live and a job and enough food to eat. The society values every citizen and every citizen values the society. And they've been living this way for thousands of years. The yetis have created a civilization that surpasses all of the great human civilizations. That's what I mean by better than normal. Isabelle propped herself up on one elbow. I agree with you that this place is a kind of utopia, she said, but don't you think it's odd that the yetis live in the mountains, hidden away from the world? Not really, Laheeti said. It doesn't sound like they trust humans very much, and I don't blame them. Who knows what might happen if the world finds out that the yetis are real? There aren't very many of them and an awful lot of us. You mean, an awful lot of humans? Isabelle asked. Laheeti nodded in the darkness and said, yes. Don't you think it's odd that there are billions of humans and only a few thousand yetis? Isabelle suggested. Laheeti frowned and said, what do you mean? Well, you said so yourself, the yetis are better than normal, she explained. They're better than us, better than humans, bigger, faster, stronger, and maybe smarter. So why are there so few of them and so many of us? They ought to be winning. They ought to be the #1 species on the planet. Laheeti raised his eyebrows. Maybe we don't really want to know the answer to that question, he said. Isabelle laid back. Well, I want to know the answer, she replied. They're worried about us wiping them out. But if they increase their population, the reverse might happen. They might wipe us out. It doesn't really matter anyway, because that new species of giant, intelligent rhinoceros living in Africa is probably going to wipe us all out in the next 50 years, Laheeti declared with a straight face. Isabelle frowned. What new giant rhinoceros species? She asked. Oh, you don't know, Laheeti asked innocently. It was all over the news just before we came to Nepal. Been living in the jungles of Africa for thousands of years, undiscovered. There was a long silence, at the end of which the penny dropped. I was being serious, she hissed, then rolled away from him and pulled the sheet over her head.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.